Okay, so in this particular chapter, we'll talk about Azure Instance Metadata Service. So in this particular chapter, specifically what I will do is I will create an instance, I will add some user data for that particular instance, and then using the Azure Instance Metadata, I will try to access that particular data. So let's start off by creating an instance in our Azure virtual machine. So let's go back to our console. Let's click on Create Virtual Machine. And let's create a virtual machine. Let's click create a new resource group. So I'll just call this as my RG2, click on OK. I'll create this in US East, and let's try to access this using a password. So I'll just call this as Azure user, and I'll give a password for this. And now what I need to do is I need to go to my advanced tab, and I need to add some user data. So what I'll do is I'll enable the user data, and I'll add some information. So what I'll do here is I'll just add data. For example, I just say the environment here is production, and what should happen is when I try to log into this particular virtual machine, I should be able to access this particular data. Now you can use your user data to store environmental information, like for example, which environment your virtual machine belongs to, etc. But be aware that you should never use your user data to store passwords or any other sensitive information. So that's one thing that you must be aware of. So let's just use this particular data, and let's click on review and create, and let's create this virtual machine. Okay, so a virtual machine has been created. So now the next thing we'll do is we'll go back to the documentation, and we'll try to figure out how we can access that information. So if you go down this documentation, you can see that what you need to do is you need to run a curl command on this particular URL. So this is basically a non-routable URL. So this particular URL will give you the information about the user data. And another very important thing that is highlighted here is that you can only access it from within the virtual machine. So you cannot access your metadata service from outside the virtual machine. So that's the reason why they've highlighted this. And of course, your Azure instance metadata provides information about the currently running virtual machine instance. So it not only provides you with user data information, but it also provides you with other information as well. For example, the storage, the network configuration, and the upcoming maintenance events, etc. So it's not just that your instance metadata service can be used just to get user data. It can also give you information about that particular instance, as well as other network configuration and maintenance events. So what we need to do is we need to run this particular endpoint. That is, if you're running on Linux. If you're running on Windows, what you need to do is you need to run this on your PowerShell. So since we are running it on Linux, let's try this out. So another important thing is you also need to run this particular utility called JQ. So let's first install this particular utility, and after that what we'll do is we'll run this particular curl command. So this is the public IP address of our virtual machine. So what I'll do is I will just log in using PuTTY. So let's open PuTTY. So again, it's on port 22. Let's click on open, click on yes. So it's Azure user, and the password that I had set while creating the instance. Okay, so let's clear the screen. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll run a sudo apt get update. And then I will run the JQ utility. Yes. Okay, so now let's clear the screen and let's run that particular URL. So let's go back to that particular page again. Okay, so now let's copy this and let's run this in our and this is the set of information that you get as an output. So here you can see that you get information about the environment. So this is basically an Azure public cloud. The operating type is basically it's a Linux instance. It's running on East US. The name of the virtual machine is this. This is the Ubuntu operating system. So here you get a lot of information about this particular instance. So let's go down again and let's also get the network information. So here's the disk information. And here's the network information. So this gives you both the public IP as well as the private IP for this particular instance. And what we need here is basically the user data. So now if you look at this user data, you can see that it's basically gibberish. Now that's because it's base 64 encoded. So what we need to do is we also need to base 64 decode this to get the information that we require. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to get a specific URL to get just this particular user data from this particular metadata instance. So if you go back through the documentation, you can see that there is also a topic on how just to get the user data from that particular metadata service. So what we need to do is we need to run this particular URL. So it's not just the metadata instance, but you also append it with the compute and the user data. And finally, at the end, what you're going to do is you're going to format it as a text and you're going to base 64 decode this. So what you can do is you can just run this URL. So again, this particular documentation I'll give in the descriptions below. So you can just copy this and let's go back to our instance. And let's paste it. So here what I'm planning to do is I'm just going to extract this particular user data and I'm just going to base 64 decode it. So this is again the endpoint. So let's run this particular URL. And here you can see that I get the output, which is env prod. Okay, so for this particular lecture, let's just leave it at this particular user data. Again, these URLs I'll give in the description below, and I'll also provide you the link to this particular documentation. So once again, I've used two URLs. The first URL was to get all the information, and the second URL is just specifically just to get the user data. Now, like I said previously, you can also use your metadata service to get other information as well. Now, that's something that I'll discuss in the upcoming chapters. Now, for this particular chapter, that's about it. So I'll see you in the next.